Today we are going to start assembling this frame. We got to get the frame together, and then once that is done, we can start assembling and trimming up these side panel boards and then try to get those stained, hopefully to get the final assembly completed tomorrow. No time to waste. I'm going to start by doweling together everything that's getting doweled. I got a bunch of clamps. Then I guess we'll just go from there and see what happens.
The two big goals I had for this day were to assemble those dowel joints, which are going to become the supports for the drawers when we put those in later. And number two, to get the final assembly of the bed frame. That way we can actually start using it, and that way it settles into place before we do all of our final cuts on the outside faces. Basically, I wanted this frame to adjust and to settle into its final resting position of where it wanted to naturally sit in that environment on my uneven floor before we did any of the final cuts on those outside faces. And that way we will get perfect gaps at the end the entire way around. To begin, I'm going to use compressed air just to blow off all the loose dust and debris, especially on those surfaces that we're going to be gluing. Now, when we drilled the dowel holes in part 2, one of the things I said in the end of the episode was to mark all of the faces that are going to be mated together. So when you were drilling in the dowel holes, you should also have paired your drawer support, that 2x4 beam that's running across, with that 11-inch leg that it will be paired with. Now, if you didn't do that, it's not the end of the world. It's not super critical. I did that so I knew I would have a perfectly flat face between the side of the leg and that edge of the drawer support, so that way the drawer slide could run along that surface without an issue. If you don't have a perfectly flat surface when you join the two together, you're going to have to sand that down. As for combining the joints, it's really quite simple. You're putting wood glue both in the dowel holes, you're tapping those dowel pins in, and you're putting wood glue on both faces of the joint that you're connecting, then just using a clamp to stick them together. Now, I know that really big clamps like these ones are not necessarily cheap, and I said I wanted to do this with cheap tools. I actually borrowed these. I do not own these. These are like $100 per clamp or something ridiculous. But there is something called a pipe clamp, which I will link below, and it's something like $15. And what you can do is buy a metal pipe for like another $10. You just cut that metal pipe to length, you put these clamps on it, and you're literally using the metal pipe as the length of the clamp. Those allow you to do these really long joints on a relatively low budget, and that's actually how I got started as well, so I will be sure to link those in the description below. But as for what's getting doweled to where, this should be pretty straightforward, because the only things you should have doweled were pretty much highlighted in part 2. You should have 3 of the 4x4 legs with dowel holes in them. You should have 4 of the 2x4 legs that have dowel holes in them, and then you should have 6 of those 32 3/4-inch length runners that are going to be the drawer support. Those are cut out of a 2x4, and each of those should have 2 dowel holes directly into the end. You can probably figure this out on your own, but those dowel holes are going into the side of the leg. Of those 6 that are 32 3/4-inch, 2 of them should have dowel holes on both ends. Those ones are going between the 4x4s, and the 4x4s are going to combine with those 2 pieces to make one long piece at the foot of the bed. As you'll see momentarily, I had to get pretty creative with my clamps because I knew I did not have a piece of pipe that was long enough to use my pipe clamps to get this whole thing. So instead, I basically made myself a second clamping surface using smaller clamps and then clamped off of that. And to be honest, it's held up great, and it still has all of the strength I've needed from this joint. So, you know, it looks weird, but it works, so it worked. And I know someone in the comments will probably get mad about this, but I don't know what else to say there. It worked, so f*** you. But anyway, while this was drying, I moved everything in the room out of the way. I swept off the floor so that I wouldn't have dog hair and stuff in my way. And let's jump to after this has had time to dry and all the materials have been moved inside.
Everything is now in the room. Mattress is flipped up. Everything is on cardboard just so I don't damage the floor accidentally. Anyhow, I'm assembling this directly on the floor just so I know exactly how it's going to sit level-wise. I will be using sliders on the final product that will help it self-level a little bit more. But again, today is just to get all the frame together so we can rough fit the outsides and get those trimmed up nicely. Without farther ado, let's get assembling.
This is going to be just like the dry fitting of the frame that we did in part 2, and if you marked everything like I said you should in part 2, you'll already know which corner goes where, and the L brackets and the holes and the screws for them will all line up perfectly, and this outer frame will be a breeze. But if you already stained it like I did, there's a chance that your stain could have covered up your pencil markings. Just something to keep an eye out for. If you haven't done this before, stain will cover those, so make sure that when you're marking it with the pencil, you mark it deep enough to see later. Because I did such a phenomenal job marking and I have such great literacy skills, I didn't even really have to square these things up before I screwed them in, and it still came out perfectly square after. Now I did check, I did make sure using this framing square, but if you're doing this on your own, this will be as good or as bad now as it was when you did your initial rough fitting. So just keep that in mind, put in the effort up front, it will pay off now. I did the same thing of reusing the same holes when installing those 2x4 fence post brackets and the horizontal supports that those are holding up. Then when you're standing it up and putting the legs underneath, you have this single long piece that's going at the foot of the bed. Make sure that the 2x4 is facing towards the center of the bed. It is on the inside. Otherwise, your drawer slides will be set back into that little divot and they're not going to open, and you'll figure that out pretty quickly later on. And if you have hardwood floors like I do, cardboard underneath will help prevent floor scratches. But with the frame on the legs, we are now going to attach the legs to this perimeter. On the materials list, there are 4 corner braces. I'll link them again below here. On the corner that I was working on, I ended up taking out the L bracket on the upper half, re-squared everything to make sure it was perfect, made sure all the faces of the leg were lined up with the outside faces of the 2x4 on top of it, then fastened everything together using that corner bracket before reinstalling that L bracket on top of it. This is more or less the same approach that I used for all the other corners as well, and then when I was attaching that center leg at the foot of the bed, I just used those L brackets to attach the 2x4 on the top directly to the 4x4 on the side. Had to be a little bit of a contortionist to reach that one, but you will be able to do it. Going back to the installation on the corners, the reason I uninstalled the L brackets when I was installing the corner braces is I found that my squareness was a little bit off from one corner to the other, but then when I adjusted one corner, it would move my other corners a little bit out of whack. What I eventually figured out is that I didn't account for the size of the lath screw heads within the brackets. So when I cut those 2 horizontal supports that go across from the left to the right side, I cut those based on like the ideal nominal size and spacing between those, and I didn't take off any material to account for the screw heads and to account for the bracket thickness, which means I was bowing out this frame slightly in the center, and that is why my corners were not square. So it took me 1 or 2 corners before I figured that out. Then I pulled out those center supports, trimmed them down a little bit in length, and put them back in. This is the thing I was alluding to in the first episode when I was cutting the materials, is you might have the perfect measurements. You might have done all the math and all the calculations, but in the practical application, when you're really dry fitting this and you're really assembling it, it's not going to be the exact same in reality as it might come off on paper. This was absolutely one of those cases for me where I had to trim these boards down to get a good square fitment at all 4 corners of this frame. So that is one other thing to keep in mind if you've never done anything like this before, is anytime you move one corner, because it's all interconnected, that means the other 3 have moved as well. So if one gets shifted, you have to recheck all the others. But now that those center boards were trimmed down, I was really happy with how this thing squared out. So let's take a moment to talk about that.
All 4 corners are now securely bracketed. Everything is staying very square. I'm actually very happy with how it's all lining up so far. I'm actually a little surprised as well because I didn't think it would come out this perfect on the first time, and I think a big part of that is from me dry fitting it outside and trimming a few of these boards as I needed to. So next in line, we have to assemble these rails that are going to be going under these center supports, and we have to do these center feet as well. That'll be a little more complex because we don't really have these vertical supports that are going to be connecting them until we put the drawers in place. So I'm worried that there's going to be a little bit more play in them. However, I think it's something we'll be able to overcome. It's just going to be, you know, a little more playing with it to get it lined up right. I don't really have a planned approach how we're going to do it yet, so I'm just going to give it a shot and we'll see what happens.
If you want the frame to be at a point that you can use it and that you could put bed slats over the top of it and then throw your mattress on it, this is pretty much at that point. To be clear, this is like the bare minimum point that you could feasibly do that, and we're going to add a little bit more support here in a minute, but yeah, it's technically possible to use it at this point. I will also be putting the 2x4 legs on the sides that are going to act as the drawer support rails as well. We'll also be adding some vertical supports towards the middle of the bed for more stability, but let's start with those outer 2x4s first. I'm once again using those 2x4 fence post brackets to hold this up on the middle to that center 4x4 leg, and I have it centered on that 4x4 leg, and I have it the same depth down on that 4x4 leg as I do on that 2x4 leg on the other side, which is 3.5 inches to the top of that that 2x4. After carefully measuring everything out, I installed the 4 brackets between the 2 4x4s in the center, then screwed in the 2x4s to make that full drawer support that ran from the left to the right side of the bed. But what I very quickly realized was this was another case where I would have to do some more trimming, so let's talk about that now.
Looking at this lower rail here in the middle, it's lined up pretty well on this one side, and then coming around to the other side, you'll see that it is sticking out by a lot. A lot. It's going to be the same thing that we had as an issue for these uppers, where the bolts, or screws rather, that are inside of that little U bracket, those are sticking out too much and it's pushing it out on both sides. Therefore, we're going to have to trim these 2 boards down a little bit to recenter this block in the middle and to make it so that these can both be flush on both outsides. So we're going to measure how much it's sticking out by, divide it by 2, and chop that much off of each of these 2 blocks. I'm going to have the same issue with the other leg, so I'll probably just go ahead and get those done at the same time. So I'll resume after that's all done, and these are actually going to sit where they're supposed to sit.
Now I know it's still sticking out in this shot, but I wanted to make sure that there was nothing else that needed to be trimmed prior to me setting up and breaking out the saw and having to go through that whole process. So I also installed the vertical supports in the center here. I believe they are 28 and 30 inches for the middle and the lower one, but those fit just about perfectly, so I was able to L bracket those in. Now I definitely went overkill with the number of L brackets I used, but if you're trying to minimize the amount that you're using, make sure you stagger them on opposite sides of high versus low. That way it is less likely to twist over time. Now that I put the vertical supports in as well, this frame is a lot more sturdy, and because of that, when you check how square it is at this point, it's going to be more representative of how it is at the end. So what I realized is those horizontal cross beams, I didn't trim those down as much as I should have earlier. So I ended up pulling those back out to trim them down more, because even though I was able to get the corner square earlier, I think there was a little bit of a bow in these 2x4s, so when I added these vertical supports, it kind of brought things a little bit out of alignment. But by trimming the length just a little bit, that was able to bring everything back to exactly where I needed it to be. Now that I was happy with it, I was able to reinstall the L brackets that I put in before, as well as put in the new L brackets for the remaining vertical pieces in the middle, and at this point, this thing was really sturdy. If you're just looking to build the frame for now, this is the point I would stop at. You could technically get away with where I stopped earlier, but stopping here is going to give you a very rigid structure. I felt like a 40-something-year-old dad who would fasten something to a trailer with tie downs and then just shook it a few times and said, "Yep, that's not going anywhere." Like, this thing was stable. At the time that I was doing this build, I was actually recovering from shattering my ankle, so for all the people who are here for my Dodge Viper, that's why it wasn't in the garage during this build, is, you know, it kind of couldn't drive it. But that comes into play momentarily when I try giving this frame a little bit of a test drive.
Full upper frame and the center legs are all assembled. Those are all bracketed in place. It's actually pretty secure at this point. At the point I can, like, you know, well, my ankle's kind of broken, so I don't want to put all my weight on that one. I'll sit on it. How's that? That's way easier. I'll sit on here, put my feet up.
And there you have it, folks. Irrefutable proof that that bad boy ain't going nowhere. Even sitting alone in my house, this is like the most awkward thing to try to say out loud. Anyhow, that is all you need for a functioning frame, so I think that is a good point to close out this video. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time. The squareness, every time you... Oh, she has got the squeaky ball. She's got the squeaky ball. Nailed it.